Welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for coming to the meeting this evening. This is another session, another discussion organised by Talking About Socialism from a Marxist point of view. This is, in fact, the 35th fortnightly discussion that we've had since we launched it about a year and a half ago. Obviously, we had the general election on Thursday here in Britain. And I'm sure that every single person attending has an opinion on some or all of the aspects of the election and opinions on what's going to happen next and what we should do next. Those are the three questions that I put in the mail out. What's your take? What's going to happen next? And what should socialist communists do? So I'm expecting everybody to be putting their hands up and coming into the discussion. But in order to kick it off, in a minute, I'm going to invite Will McMahon to say a few comments just to help the discussion on its way. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Nick Rack. I'm one of the organisers of Talking About Socialism. Will is another. And we've also got Chris and Soraya on the talk who are also involved in organising it. We've got a lot of regulars and I think one or two people who perhaps are at their first meeting. So first of all, the discussion is going to be recorded and it will go up shortly on YouTube. So please bear that in mind when you make your contribution, if you speak, and if you don't want to be seen, keep your video camera off. What we do when we open it up for discussion is that we normally ask people to limit their first contributions to 3 minutes so that everybody can have a go, and then we'll call people in for a second round if we've got enough time. But with that, I'm going to ask Will to kick things off. Off you go, Will.
Thanks very much, Nick. So what I'm going to do is look at the three questions that you posed, that we posed in the bulletin. What's my take? What do I expect is going to happen, and what should socialists and communists do? So in terms of my take from the election results, my first port of call is, how did those who mentioned socialism and mentioned being crucial in their program or platform, or communism in their literature, perform? How did they do? In the main, they barely registered a blip. With the exception, I think, of Maxine Bowler, from Sheffield, who did say she was a socialist and standing for socialist politics. She got 10% in Sheffield. Fiona Lally of the Revolutionary Communist Party, who got just over 4% in Stratford and Bow, and Dave Nellis, who got 2.2% for Tusk. Now Tusk, who've been standing general election candidates for over a decade now, a bit more, suffered quite a severe blow, I think, getting about a third of the votes that they got in 2015, and they averaged something like 300 votes in the 40 seats they stood in. I think Tusk may well have suffered at the hands of Galloway's non-socialist Workers' Party, who polled around 1,400 in every seat, on average, that is. There were some single-issue candidates who didn't expressly call themselves socialists. Palestine was the single issue, and many of those candidates did very well. 5 independents got themselves elected, but if you look at their politics, there's not very much left about most of them, to be honest with you. West Streeting was very nearly decapitated. Corbyn stood as a local democracy left social democrat, didn't mention socialism in his policies at all, but secured a good victory. Question was, for me, why did Labour win? If you look at the total voting population, about 1 in 5 of those who could vote voted Labour, 20%. And roughly a third of those who did vote voted Labour. The swing to Labour was just under 2%. And the Labour majority, I think we know, was delivered by the refusal of reform to stand down in many of the constituencies, as the Brexit Party had done in 2019. That's what it's about. It was reform that defeated the Conservatives, not Starmer. I don't think there's much doubt about that. Pollsters asked those who voted Labour why they voted Labour, 1 in 2 said they wanted to get the Tories out. 1 in 100 said because they liked Keir Starmer as leader, which is devastating if you think about it for Starmer. 1 in 5 because they agreed with the Labour Party's policies. This means that only 8% of those who voted Labour because they agreed with the policy platform of the party, which is a remarkable figure, I think. Self-evidently, Labour's victory in the country is very shallow and it's very narrow. The Financial Times, their data expert, John Burns-Murdoch, noted, and I quote, "The lack of enthusiasm for Labour at this election really is striking. Among those who plan to vote Labour tomorrow, the party is much less well liked than in 2019, 2017, 2015. There's no data before that. He said it's quite a flimsy voter coalition that could unravel in the absence of results. It goes on, if they don't start delivering tangible results, it wouldn't be at all surprising to see Labour start bleeding votes in all directions. And one of those directions may be, I think, and this is me, not him, maybe, and we have to keep in mind, is they might start bleeding votes to reform if we're not careful. I think there are 3 striking contrasts to be made. The first is with Blair's win in 1997. Amongst a broad layer of the public, there was a belief in 1997 that things could only get better, actually. And there was some optimism about what Blair might do. Now, at the time, I remember thinking, oh, God, this guy's going to be awful. But it was really hard to get through to people politically about it because of the kind of, he had a political dynamic and he had a coherent ideology he was arguing for. And people did want to get rid of the Tories. He had a majority bloc for third way politics that Starmer can only dream of. He got 43% of the vote, 13.5 million votes on a turnout of 71% plus. So that's one striking difference, contrast. The second is the prospects for the UK economy in the next 5 years. Now, I'd urge you all to read Michael Roberts' recent blog, Broken Britain. Roberts points out that Britain is now the 9th largest economy in the world in terms of output. The combination of being a declining imperial power, the 2008 banking crisis, the Brexit paralysis, and the pandemic have laid waste to living standards. There's, in their terms, in bourgeois economic terms, there is no money to spend. And this is a long way from the heyday of Gordon Brown, when Britain had experienced a record 50 quarters of growth by 2006. And this at the time was an all-time record. Huge contrast to when Labour came in last time. The third contrast is with the seats in Parliament, where Labour has 2/3 of the seats with 1/3 of the votes. It's difficult to imagine a parliament more unrepresentative of the population since the introduction of the universal franchise in 1928. I went back through every single general election. There's never been a parliament that's been elected with such an unrepresentative outcome. It's absolutely incredible. What do I expect to happen now? Starmer, I think, will be aware of the weakness of his long-term position. And will have to, a bit like Macron tried to, build a political coalition after the election because he wasn't capable of doing it beforehand. He'll attempt to squat the centre ground of politics in the decade to come while driving politics further to the right, because there is very little sign that he will build a coalition from a social democratic position, as he's made it clear that without growth, there will be no social investments. But the kind of growth he's going to be after, of course, is neoliberal growth. This will involve completing what remains of the Thatcher/Blair project, reducing further the size of the state, but having an active enabling state that uses private finance for infrastructure and other projects to keep the debt off the books. So, for example, private finance in the NHS, I think we know what's coming there, is the kind of deconstruction of the NHS, the final deconstruction of it, I think. They will introduce one of Blair's favourite ideas, which is co-payment for health services, and they will sell it on the basis that these middle-class people who are getting health service for free when they're quite well off, they should do co-payment, yeah, and it'll be a way of introducing payment across the whole of the health service, beyond, of course, dentistry and physiotherapy and all this other stuff that people have to pay for if they really, really need it because the queues are so long. They will deregulate house building, and they will privatise any government work where possible, perhaps under the guise of some form of trust status. So it'll be a thoroughly neoliberal growth programme that they'll be aiming for. It will also mean that although the state is smaller, it's got to be much more dynamic. I think this is their big plan. So you've got a dynamic state, strategic in its relationship with capitalist investment. Much like, I think what's in their minds is it's much like South Korea or Japan or other countries that have had to rebuild their economies and their national economic basis. So it's kind of not quite state-centered investment, but a very active state to encourage private investment and make it possible. And I think we know what that means in terms of working class living standards and working class rights. Now, Blairism got a huge sigh of public relief, I think, from most people, not from me, but from most people. And there was some hope expressed with the defeat of the Tories. And he got a decent interval before the left was able to make an effective call to arms. While Starmer, I think, will get a brief pause, the strategy of governing from the centre while moving politics to the right will bring the government into conflict with the working class and the internationalist movements, I think, in pretty short order. It'll be a government that stands above, but eventually sides with the ruling class on wage growth. It may offer some limited trade union law reforms, but I think that will be about it. As a confirmed Atlanticist, we can expect the continuation of policy as dictated by Washington, which will produce domestic political conflict on issues we know well, the imperialist attack on Palestine, the inter-imperialist war in Ukraine, and the war drive against China. And as Michael Roberts points out in the Broken Britain article, a lot of the British economy is now owned by US multinationals these days, and that really matters quite a lot. As a neoliberal politician, we can expect sluggish movement from them on developing a proper strategy for dealing with the developing climate crisis. If the government has not got money to spend, then it's only through private investment that the necessary steps can be made or be demonstrated that they're trying to do something to meet the climate crisis. And as we know, the bourgeoisie is simply not interested in cutting off the capitalist branch on which it sits. So if they do anything in terms of that kind of investment, the kind of environmental they would like to see will be very passive, it will be very slow, and it will not come soon enough. So on all three key elements, improving working class living standards, foreign policy, and the environmental crisis, the only difference between Sunak and Starmer is that Starmer will have time to get his statecraft right, and but it will in essence offer the same neoliberal policy mix. Internally, I think in the Labour Party, the only question that remains for Starmer as party leader is whether to use the dominance he has in the Labour Party to revisit the mistake that Blair made and ensure that the socialist left is locked out of the party structure for good. And I'm pretty certain that that's something they'll be thinking about really seriously, having learned the lessons of Corbynism. What should socialists and communists do? I mean, there is the obvious stuff. I mean, prepare for class battles against austerity, the global war drive, and the ecological crisis being driven by capitalist growth that Starmer and Reeves so desire. But we also have to begin a long march towards a united socialist party committed to the replacement of capitalist democracy with a socialist democracy based on popular planning, which will require the destruction of capitalist markets. One way of doing this is to take part in those social and political struggles that will emerge. A second way is to build a united electoral socialist coalition with a programme that explains clearly what we aim to do immediately and the direction that we are travelling in and where we want to get to. We need to develop that programme. Now, Taz's statement of aims is good, but a common programme for socialist and communist left is a necessity. If Starmerism is to bleed votes in all directions, then we need to be ready for that. Such a large majority promises a high number than usual of by-elections and incidents. So we need to begin to think about how to have an electoral presence, which I think will be necessary. Third, we've got to reject the notion that left social democratic politics dressed up as socialism is going to cut through and deliver. Corbynism has demonstrated that this idea is vulnerable on a whole number of fronts. Fourth, if such a left social democratic formation does emerge, we need to engage constructively with it, but not water down our politics in doing so. Participation in it should be a tactical question that can't be resolved in advance, as the last 25 years have shown. And I was just remembering it's 25 years since the launch of the London Socialist Alliance. And nobody had really thought of that. And it led to a whole series of developments that we hadn't thought of. And we had to respond to. And we got quite a few wrong, I think. But we're going to have to, again, think on our feet. Fifth, we need to recognise that the Labour Party offers a limited site of contestation, but where it does take a tactical attitude to it, not a religious vow for being in the Labour Party or against being in the Labour Party. It depends what's happening locally, right? There may be some local Labour lefts that emerge that are socialist, and we need to recognise that. Sixth, we need to reject the lure of personality and unnecessary compromises that it brings, whether it be another Benn or Scargill or Livingston or Corbyn or Galloway. This does not mean we should not build united fronts where necessary, but we should never suborn our socialist programme to bureaucratic deals or stitch-ups. Seventh, and I'll finish on this, we need to create socialist clubs or something like it across the country. There are a space for socialists and communists who believe in the transformation of our society to meet, discuss, campaign and work our way towards the mass socialist party that's so urgently needed.
Thank you very much, Will. You packed a hell of a lot into that. I'm sure that people have got lots to say in response and to give their own thoughts that I'm sure you've been thinking about over the last 3, 4, 5 days or whatever it is. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open it up for discussion. If people can indicate by clicking the yellow hand, which should be at the bottom of your screen. If you can't find that, then put your hand up and wave it about. And hopefully, if I don't see it, somebody will bring you to my attention and I'll call you in. But there's a lot of meat there. And there's a lot of other stuff that Will wasn't able to get into the 15 minutes that he had. So can I see who wants to come in first of all, please? Chris Strafford.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Will. Yeah, I mean, I agree pretty much almost entirely with what Will has outlined in those 15 minutes. I think, the Labour Party will be looking over its shoulder at reform over the next few years. Reform has come second in many, many Labour seats with quite respectable vote tallies. And I think what we will see is that reform will not necessarily set the tone, but will certainly set the agenda in terms of the way the debate will go on migration, on culture war issues, and what have you. And I think when we, as a left, look to respond to that, it's important to not get caught up with anti-Farageism or anti-reform or what have you, to make sure that we have our own independent politics as well, rightly outlined. And that means also then taking aim at the Labour Party. And in the past, we have failed to do this. I remember when the British National Party was a thing, and we would be running up and down the country campaigning against the British National Party, but for what? Well, for what in the end was the Labour Party. And without our own independent politics, our own independent position, what we end up doing is strengthening the centre. We see some of that possibly happening in France in the coming weeks as the Macronists and what have you try and form a centrist government. One of the interesting things about reform, I think, as well, is that Farage has immediately jumped on a democratic question, which Will outlined so well a moment ago as well, about 33% of the vote, 66% of the seats. If we had proportional representation, the Labour Party would not be in government at the moment, but it certainly would be in a majority government at least. And I think these kind of questions, which the left often ignores, having your vote matter, having your say on relationship with Europe, or on constitutional questions and what have you, are actually very important to the majority of the working class, and they're very interested in these things beyond trade union struggles and what have you. So I think we need to be careful there as well, that when we are going out into the movement and building our organizations, that we keep a strong focus on democratic questions, on making sure that the right and the far right under Farage do not steal our clothes on freedom of speech, on proportional representation, and on genuine democracy. One thing that I will end on is that every day of the campaign, every day that we were out knocking doors and what have you, the primary thought I had after every conversation was, God, if we had a party, we could do this so much better. We could do so much more if only we had a party. I think that's the primary tasks of communists in the coming period, is to build up those forces as well as outlined, and build a communist party, whatever the name.
Thanks very much, Chris. Hopefully get time to call you back in a bit later on with a bit of a report from Manchester Central, if possible. So I've got Matthew Jones, followed by Janet Sillett. So Matthew, fire away.
Hi, comrades. I just want to say a few things about Scotland. I think it's an interesting facet of the whole piece. Will talking about the Foundation of Socialist Alliance. It's also roughly a few months, 25 years and a few months since the foundation of the Scottish Socialist Party, which some of us were members of, which of course marked actually the collapse of political collapse of much of the left, and the final sort of denouement of the process of collapse of the left, and I mean the far left, the religiously revolutionary left, into Scottish nationalism. The notion that somehow the creation of a new capitalist state in Scotland was going to solve any problems, rather than actually, of course, Marx's notion that the working class actually was a solution to the issues of capitalism. Final. There's still not been a reckoning for that, of course. There's still people claiming to be revolutionaries, etc., who hold the Scottish nationalism. Can't see it myself, but the interesting thing what's happened at the moment, of course, is obviously what you're seeing is the collapse of the SNP vote. I mean, obviously after 2015, when that Scottish nationalist thing was promoted as the solution to all things, successfully and in part by actually the collapsed remnant of the politically collapsed remnant of the far left, saying that Scottish nationalism was the answer. The SNP vote, of course, went up to well in excess of 1 million votes, and of course the thing about Scotland, of course, if you get more than 40%, of course you get everything. They were the last election, they had 45% of the vote in Scotland. This time they only had 30%. They lost 500,000 votes. So in those terms, I mean, it's a crisis. It's a sort of crisis of nationalism and of the collapse of that as an alternative, which is sort of unfortunately, of course, presents itself, of course, as the political inadequacies and shenanigans of the SNP itself. So we've got a series of things, in terms of the inability to deliver public services, their attacks on public service workers, the fact that we're now, basically all the councils have started sacking school teachers or removing school teacher jobs, which is probably something that's not unknown to people in England, but hasn't really happened in Scotland to any great degree, until just now. Of course, basically all public service, other than that, of course, all public services are on their knees, and they're now attacking the unions. We've now got to a position where there's a strike until the last couple of weeks ago from the, finished up over the summer, will recommence of the FE lecturers, where the SNP's managers of FE colleges are essentially trying to break the union, and have promised to lock out the workers. So you can see where that happens, and I think, you know, in terms of, you can see an increase in the Labour Party vote, but obviously things are, this changes things not a great lot. It merely moves the focus, but doesn't actually resolve the crisis. Anyway, I can go into it more.
That's great, Matthew. Thanks very much, Janet.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. The nature of Starmer's government, I think, will summarize extremely well around the economy. So I don't want to say much about that, except today, even, in fact, even on Friday, I think they have actually gone and done quite a few things. The one thing we can't say about them, that they weren't well planned. So there's a massive contract went out the day after the election. Oh, published. I mean, it was published to invite for a massive tech contract for the NHS. A huge amount of, in terms of defense, as today, and money going to, and weapons going to Ukraine. There was the announcement on housing, which was exactly, I think, followed what we were saying. So there's a, you know, they're going to do what they said on the tin, basically. I think in foreign policy, though, which Will didn't have time, I suppose, to consider, I think it's much more complicated, and it'll be much more complicated for Starmer, particularly around the Middle East and particularly around Palestine, because they are going to have to balance very different interests, both here and abroad, globally, around with the US, the administration, and with the EU. And how are they going to do that? There was the appointment of the new Attorney General, which I think is interesting. Whether it's significant, it must be significant in some way. He was not going to appoint somebody who is admittedly a very esteemed barrister, human rights barrister, who is a Jewish, I think a Zionist, but has made very explicit statements about the illegality of a lot of what Israel is doing. And I think in the past too, around the occupation. So what does that mean? I think it does mean that they will not flout, or not want to flout, international law, because it would seem, I think, untenable for Starmer to do that. And they've already today, I think, said that they will go back on what the Tories were doing to try and delay any arrests coming from the ICC judgment. And does that mean they're going to change their position on Palestine? No, I don't think it does. I think the rest of it is not going to be that different. They're going to continue, I think, with the kind of JLM line that we hate Netanyahu, but actually we're not going to ever say that Israel shouldn't defend itself. All of that stuff. They're not going to go back on BDS. They may actually temporarily stop on selling components to Israel for all kinds of reasons, I think. So I think there is a kind of question mark about whether they will be any different to the Tories. Now, clearly there are just as Zionists, possibly more so. The cabinet is probably more Zionist than the Tories were, but strategically and tactically, I'm not really sure. Just on the future around, where is it? I think something that Chris said, I do agree with him about, not going into the kind of anti-Farage thing and focusing on that and then ignoring the wider picture. But looking, at Europe, looking at the threat from fascists, in some cases from the ultranationalists, and so on. I mean, we can't just not see that as an immediate threat, and we have to know how that we're going to respond to that. And that does fit in with how a socialist party differs entirely from say, Galloway, or some of the left are attracted clearly to the Workers' Party or to that brand of leftism. And a socialist response really, I think, has to show where there is that huge difference between, communists or socialists and a kind of nationalist, contradictory policy, populist policy coming from Galloway. So I think we have to have not a program. We have to look strategically at how we deal with that.
Okay, Jen, I'm going to have to come back later on your next point, if that's okay.
That's fine. Yeah. No, I don't think I've got another point here.
All right. So interesting points raised there by Janet on the question of foreign policy, and also a bit of a difference perhaps with Chris on the question of how we respond or take up Farage and the reform. Can I see who else wants to come in? I know you've all been thinking about this and talking about it at home and perhaps with friends and family, so don't hold back. There's lots of points to be made, I'm sure. Sandy. I'm going to call in Sandy and then Minnie.
You hear me?
Yes.
Right, okay. One or 2 points that I want to make. I think that we have to look, what does the left do now? The Labour Party's dead as far as I can see it for socialist politics, and we need a mass socialist party. I don't think any of us would disagree. It's how we get there, given the situation we're in at present. I mean, I think Corbyn's victory was very important and useful, but particularly useful if he's actually going to use it to try and set up something throughout Britain. I mean, you talk about socialist clubs, etc., a socialist current, or whatever it is, a mass organisation that argues for policies in the interest of the working class. Obviously, there will be debate within such an organisation on what policies we should be adopting, but there's some obvious ones like building council housing, tax the rich, nationalisation under workers' control. There's a whole list of policies that we'll be able to get agreement on. So I've got a bit more of a favourable view to Galloway than obviously that's been mentioned so far, in that I think his call for Corbyn to launch a new socialist party and for him to say that, Corbyn will be the leader of it and the Workers' Party would go into it, I think that could give, if it happened, if Corbyn was on, it could be a catalyst for building an organisation that will support workers in struggle. And I think the most important struggles we're going to confront at the moment are the anti-imperialist struggles. Imperialism is driving towards war. We can see the genocide in Palestine at the moment. We can see the terrible death and destruction in Ukraine, provoked and armed by Western imperialism. These things are really crucial. They're going to be spending a lot of money on that. There's talk about moving towards conscription, and we have to have a working class opposition to an anti-war, anti-imperialist opposition. And I think if Corbyn was willing to launch such a thing, socialists would begin in there. It doesn't mean we don't need a communist party. We definitely do, with a worked out international programme of how we transition towards socialism. But a step towards that would be a mass organisation of class struggle, where Marxists can put forward their politics in the struggle itself to build an anti-imperialist movement to fight in solidarity with the people of Palestine. So that's what I think we should be aiming for, a mass current, and not simply just small groups, again, doing propaganda work. I think that with the Labour Party moving so obviously to the right, the end of the Labour left, really, there is a vacuum there that people like Corbyn and even Galloway could be stepping in to try and build. Obviously, there'd be debates that would have to be democratic. One of the major problems with Galloway is he's totally undemocratic, as well as the problems with his British nationalism. That's what I would say.
Thanks very much, Sandy. Came in just 2 seconds under, so that's very good. Thank you. I'm going to ask Minnie to come in now, and I've got Matthew's got his hand up for a second go, but I'd really like to hear from people that haven't spoken before I call in others that have already spoken. So, Minnie, fire away.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Will, for that really good introduction, and all comrades for all your contributions. I liked what Will said about, I thought, the bourgeoisie sitting on a branch. Now that's a branch of a tree. That sure as hell is precarious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think we have the luxury of time, of a really long time to form a party that we're going to form. I think the mood on the left after this election is more one of optimism than previously, because we did see some pro-Gaza candidates take some Labour scalps. And we also saw some Labour, right-wing Labour, like Wes Streeting, now Health Secretary, was it 500 votes that he came so close to losing his seat, as did Jess Phillips, came really close to losing her seat to pro-Gaza, pro-Palestine candidates, anti-war candidates. Also, obviously, the Greens are to the left of Labour now, and they won 4 seats. But I know this isn't. I think one of our biggest problems is the media. It's such a huge problem. They will not platform the left. Obviously, I wonder why. The Labour Party's over. Agree with Sandy, and I agree on that point that we need, if there is a movement that we can, as Marxists, as socialists, can go into and start to agitate and be a faction, etc., then let's get in there. Also, we had a candidate stand here in Liverpool, Wavertree. They put some really good publicity, really good leaflets out, but they only polled, is it 1,119 votes? But it was a good campaign, and that's a beginning. She's a worker, a nurse, etc. So I just don't think we've got the luxury of time. We have to come together with. I think there's a meeting tomorrow night. Matthew, you put something on WhatsApp. There's a meeting tomorrow night about coming together and forming a party of the left. Obviously, we're not discussing the European elections, the French elections here, but that was very, very interesting how the left, I know it's a broad coalition, got its act together, was it within 3 days? And I know it's, and they're, on the media last night, they were really bashing the left, just constantly bashing the left. But if you look at the votes for the coalition of the left, then they kind of equal the votes of Marine Le Pen and La Parti La République, and then you've got Macron in the middle. So, but that was really good news. So we need to get our act together. They've started something there, get talking and also not standing against other candidates in elections that are on the left, actually standing single candidates so the left has a chance. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks very much, Minnie. I'm going to call in Soraya, and can I please see other hands coming up? So Soraya.
Yes, Minnie has raised lots of interesting points, as has her other comrade, but I think it's a very, as we all set out, I think it's a very complicated situation, actually, because as Will said, when you look at the actual percentage of the vote and even the number of people who voted, it's much lower than the past. I think it's the second lowest since a participation of voters since 1918. So what does it mean? I think it means that Starmer, there was the vote for Labour because people wanted to get rid of the Tories, but the lack of the number of people who didn't vote at all high because Starmer wasn't offering anything. Starmer, I think, is now going to, the Labour Party is now going to be the Tories, because the Tories themselves are in such disarray. In actual fact, the Labour Party presents a much better option for the ruling class, apparently much more stable and reliable, actually, because they're not going to do anything to rock the boat, as others have said. I think, forgive me, comrade, I can't remember who it was that said this, whether it was Matthew, but I think that it would be wonderful if we had a figure that is known and has had support in the past for putting forward even mildly socialist words to form something. I don't think Corbyn is going to do that. I think he is wedded to the Labour Party, institutionalised, and cannot see anything beyond the Labour Party. I know he stood as an independent, but I think that he has a dream that one day he'll go back. We could see from his programme, his demands, it was nothing in the slightest bit radical, socialist. So the question at Galloway, would Galloway step in? I think somebody said, well, I don't think you could support, as a socialist, as a communist, you could support Galloway. That's not being sectarian. It's about what his programme is and what he is putting forward. And so I don't think you could. I think there's a whole discussion on the Popular Front, the new Popular Front in France, and whether that was the correct thing to do. Yes, it kept the National Rally out, but again, I'm not sure that I don't think I would have called for that in France. It's not easy, I know, but the question is, we haven't got the luxury of time, as Minnie said. I wish there were something that I think could join. I hope there is some formation. I don't know what this thing tomorrow that Minnie was talking about. I haven't seen about that. But a party of the left would be wonderful. But it is a complicated situation, and it is what do we do? I think we have to continue and to agitate for socialism, communism, and yes, be involved and not say, oh, you know, we're finished with the Labour Party. I don't have any illusions in the party or what its leadership wants to do, but wherever there are people who I think that we can convince, I think that's where we should be. And I would very much like to hear about more from Chris about the Communist Futures election campaign. And just to finish, if there's some sort of electoral pact, don't stand against other candidates. It's who are the other candidates? I mean, you know, there should. I don't think there should ever be a every situation has to be carefully scrutinized and see what program people are standing on. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't form alliances unless everybody agrees with every last word on a program. But I think there has to be a socialist program being put forth and forward, and by that I don't mean again it necessarily has to be the Communist Manifesto per se, but it has to be something that is calling for an end to this system that kills people in war, in working conditions, and so on. And I'll just finish there.
Thanks very much, Soraya. I've got Andy Walker next, please.
Thanks, Nick. The questions that you put on the table, I'll try and address. How long have I got, by the way?
3 minutes.
Okay. So, what's your take on the results? As someone who actually campaigned during the election for a left of centre Labour candidate, the feedback that I was getting on the doors, I wasn't surprised at the low turnout, quite frankly. I thought it might have been even lower. There was no enthusiasm whatsoever on the doors for the programmes of any of the parties, quite frankly. Never mind just Labour. And very little enthusiasm, as was pointed out by someone who cited that, I think it was a YouGov poll about voter intentions and why they voted. So, you know, I think that confirms everything. I also thought there would be, you know, a lot of people who didn't vote as well, and obviously that was borne out by the turnout. I think, though, we have to be open and honest about the performance of left-wing organisations that stood in this last election, because, you know, I'm going to try and be kind here, but the performance was pitiful. Let's be honest about it. And, you know, there are probably all sorts of reasons for that, which we don't have time to go into now.
Jane Walker.
But the fact of the matter is, you know, 200 votes here and 300 votes there is not great return. And I think my take on the election results were, notwithstanding the massive majority, I actually think it's quite a fragile situation. And I think we could see things turn quite quickly, not necessarily in a direction that we would want to see it initially, but I think there's no doubt in my mind that, unfortunately, if Labour fails to deliver, we could probably say if and when Labour fails to deliver, then there is going to be a reaction to that. Now, will that be a reaction with a capital R? And we all know where that might mean. Or will it be increasing ferment within the Labour movement to actually lead to some organised resistance to what Labour are doing? Because if it's the former, then I think we have a real challenge, but also potentially an opportunity, a la the situation in France, where the potential and need for some kind of popular front would be sharply posed in order to keep out the forces of the right. So I don't think it's just a simple question of, is now the time right to start building a separate party, because that actually could develop. I'm not saying it will happen automatically, but the conditions could be created for that going forward as a result of other events, not necessarily where we are at the moment. And I'll finish on this point. Despite the fact that you've obviously got, you know, a massive majority for Labour, almost unprecedented in recent history, I don't really see an awful lot of enthusiasm, even among some of the people in my local Labour Party, for the end outcome of the result. And I think that tells you everything that you need to know.
Thanks very much, Andy. Some interesting points there from your personal experiences on the doorstep. I'm just going to chair myself in now before I call on a second round of people, but also before I come in, just encourage people to put your hand up and give your take. What do you think about the questions or any other matter that's arisen? Now, in terms of the discussion that's developed so far here, I've got some points to make, but they're going to be bullet points, and we're going to have to come back to some of them at a future date, because it's true that we're always up against the pressure of time, and events are always going to outreach what we can do if we've got small forces. But personally, I think there's a real danger that this can draw the left, the socialist left, the communist left, into trying to do things that it's not yet capable of doing, and looking to other forces to do what actually they've proved incapable of doing. So first of all, I agree with those comrades that have said, Will, Chris and others, our aim, and the aim of talking about socialism, it's clear on our statement. We believe that there is an absolute crying need to build a mass communist stroke socialist party. I use those two words the same, but we can't just suck it out of our thumb. We can't just create it out of nothing. It's going to take a lot of hard work. And I think the phrase patient urgency is apposite. It's urgent, but we also have to be patient in what we do. We cannot look, in my opinion, to charismatic individuals, and the left can't help, it seems, to recreate always the cult of the individual, and to look to people who are going to come in like, you know, the knight on the white charger. That's not how it's going to happen. We have to build up the confidence of the working class in its own power. And that means raising an understanding of the role of the working class in society, its potential power, and giving the ideas, bringing the ideas of socialism, communism in an organized way. I don't want to exaggerate. Some of the votes that the left got were few and far between. But from my own personal experience in Manchester Central, and I'm not getting carried away here, we got 131 votes. Well, the Communist Future candidate got 131 votes. But it was clear that the ideas that we were putting forward of a complete change in the way that society is organized, getting rid of a society that creates the rich and exploits the rest of us, they went down very, very well. But these are conversations that never really intrude in an organized way. And that is based or is a result because of the lack of an organized Communist Party or an organized Socialist Party. Where Socialist Appeal or the RCP stood in Stratford and Bow, where they turned out a mass force of hundreds and hundreds of young communists, they got 4.3% of the vote. They got well over 1,000 votes. And that was an indication, in a sense, of what you could do if you had those sort of numbers across the country. So we've got to do what we can to build those ideas. And that does mean propaganda. There's an absence of communist propaganda. And there will be struggles, and we have to intervene in those struggles with our communist program, which we need to develop more thoroughly, and with our propaganda. But Galloway, in my opinion, is a danger. He's taking people in completely a reactionary position. Corbyn has proved that he's not going to take a step. Others around him may do so. But again, if we intervene as we should, we have to engage on the discussion about the program. What is the program that any new development has? Is it going to be one that seeks to manage capitalism, which is what social democracy tries and aims to do? Or is it a movement that actually wants to break with capitalism? And we've got to sort of keep a sense of proportion in a sense. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Matthew, you've got your hand up, second time.
I think there's a few things, just, I mean, briefly. I think the issue, the interesting thing about, of course, is that elections these days are not actually fought purely by knocking on doors. Most of the effort these days goes into social media and targeting people's mobile phones, etc., etc. So I've seen entire campaigns run by having very, very few people visible, but actually the whole thing's gone through electronically, and you know, it works. The other thing I think, in terms of looking at what happened in Scotland, is to remember, when you look at the Scottish Labour Party, it's actually run. The Party of Labour in Scotland is actually run by two businessmen. One is Anna Sawar, who's the leader, and the other one is Willie Hockey, who funds it. So effectively, the Labour Party is now controlled by two businessmen in these parts. The other thing about the Scottish Labour Party, of course, is that it's now in a position, because of Gaza in particular, it cannot appear in public. Its representatives cannot appear in public without the line of police to guard them against the attentions of the masses, which may or may not have been seen by some people in last November, when Starmer was chased across Glasgow Central Station, which was very funny. But obviously, then of course meant that, say, when he visited Butte House, the First Minister's residence in Edinburgh yesterday, he ran the back because obviously he didn't want to see the Gaza protesters out the front where everybody else goes. In those terms, I think the thing about this government, of course, is, as Will said, of course, is that this is a government of war. It intends to prosecute the imperialist wars. It will go tomorrow. Starmer and co will go tomorrow to the NATO jamboree, in which, you know, they will plot the development of war. In those terms, important, because obviously the Americans intend a third war. And of course, the notion that NATO itself now is in direct conflict, I mean, without any sort of messing about or ruses and the rest of it with Russia. And the notions that have been put forward by Macron and others that actually involves NATO troops, who are already in Ukraine, but actually fighting. That clearly the Ukrainian army is in a state of collapse by any normal methods. So therefore, the thing is now dependent upon what action that NATO and particularly the US takes. In terms of Gaza, I mean, we have to say, I mean, Gaza is a US genocide as much as it's an Israeli genocide. It's not possible without the US. The US supplied all the weapons. They continue to do so. It's entirely the imperialists attempting to wipe out or flatten, the people of Gaza. They've already apparently, if you look at this, there's an article just been published in the Lancet saying the actual death toll is something around about 186,000 people, they estimate, in real terms, because obviously it's very difficult to count dead now. So in those terms, they've managed to kill 8% of the people in Gaza. So what we're looking at is that, as I say, is that drive to war. Now, the problem is, of course, Corbyn is not going to break the Labour Party. The question is the left has to get itself organised. And it has to say, to move away from the problem that we've got with the Gaza issue, is that it's basically on a revulsion. The reaction, which is great, which is based on a revulsion, and not on an understanding of imperialism. And there is no reaction to Ukraine. And the two should be put together. And we do have to react against imperialism in general. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Matthew. I'm just going to try to encourage people who haven't spoken to come in, and particularly if you've got any disagreements with anything that's been said so far, including whether it's with something that Will said or I said. One of the things that we try to encourage is discussion and debate and bringing out differences, because that always helps to clarify ideas, clarify things, but also personal experiences. What are people saying where you are? What are people looking to? What are they hoping for? So with that, can I see anybody who hasn't spoken? Or I'll take people coming back for a second time. Okay. Chris, I'm going to ask you if you could give perhaps a bit more detail about Manchester Central, where Communist Future stood, perhaps tying it in with some of the points that Andy raised about low votes.
Yeah, I mean, Andy's right. He's absolutely right in what he said. They were a paltry return for almost every single socialist and communist candidate. And those of us involved in Communist Future had under no illusion that we would be receiving a relatively small vote. I mean, Will outlined it earlier, but I thought the RCP did excellently. I thought their campaign, the way they conducted their campaign was excellent in some very difficult conditions where they were under quite a lot of hostile attack from others on the left for simply standing. But I think one of the things that, with regards to what Andy has said, I mean, the left is a mess. I mean, and when you look at the ballots in just in Manchester or Greater Manchester, and you look who's on there, and you see, you've got Communist Future, who the hell is that? You've got Communist League, who the hell is that? Communist Party of Britain, you're up in Bury, you've got the Workers' Party, you've got Trade Unionist Socialist Coalition, and then you've got lots of different independents and what have you, and it's a complete mess. It's not just a complete mess in Manchester, it's a complete mess in England, Wales and Scotland, and it's a complete mess in Britain. And the only real solution, and what other contributors have touched on, is for a new united party. I would disagree on some of the nature of that party. I mean, before I really say any more on Communist Future, I mean, what communists should not be in the business of creating a party that is not our own. If Corbyn and Andrew Murray and the rest of them get together and launch a new initiative, we may have to be involved in that. We will see what happens. It's not for us to build a party, a mass party, or another Labour Party where we get to be a happy minority in that. Our job is to fight for a mass communist party. That means constantly focusing on our politics, not nobody else's. And apologise to Janet, maybe I wasn't clear, but my point was that we should fight the far right on our politics, not on Macron's or not on the centre of British politics or what have you. And I suspect we agree on that. In terms of communist future, we got 131 votes, I think. We expected there or thereabout. We came 9 out of 10. The Workers' Party was standing. It was independent standing as well. It was relatively pro-Palestine. But I think the key thing for us was taking the argument that you can stand communist candidates, that communists should go out there and make the arguments for communism, no matter how hard it is. And we drew in people from different organizations, from different backgrounds and what have you to come and campaign with us. And I'm sure that was seen in other places as well, such as Stratford and Bow with the RCP. One of the things we managed to get a leaflet through every door that spelled out communism and tried to engage people in thinking about those kind of ideas, what it means for working class, what working class power means. We knocked on thousands of doors, had hundreds of conversations all over the constituency, primarily in Ancoats and Beswick and in Cheetham Hill, which are, as Andy will know, are two heavily working class areas that have kind of been left behind as other parts of Manchester have been redeveloped and what have you. And what we found, I think, was much of what he said himself, which is there's not really much of an appetite for the Labour Party or for anyone. And it was not very hard to enter into a conversation with people who had very clearly understood what was going on in Manchester, but what was going on in the country as well, in terms of rising rents, food prices, the state of the NHS, and what have you. And obviously, a lot of people were very sympathetic to ending the onslaught in Palestine. What I think needs to happen, as well as said, and many other comrades on this discussion have already said, is that doing this piecemeal, doing this in a way that duplicates our work, that often because of resources or the amount of money and what have you, comes across amateurish and ineffective. It needs to be superseded, and that can only be superseded through organisation, common work, and the creation of a communist party. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks very much, Chris. Who wants to come in next? If there are no new hands, I'll take people that have already spoken. So do please put your hand up.
John's got his hand up.
John, okay, John Fitzgerald, thank you.
See the audio. There we go.
Just 1 second.
John, we can't hear John. John, you've been sorry. There's a confusion because Toby's mic came on, and John, we can't hear you because you're on mute.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah, I think that the actual turnout of the vote, I mean, as somebody said, it's so low that between the main parties, Tory, they only got 60% of the vote. Labour actually only increased their vote by 1.6%. It was lower than Corbyn in terms of vote, the number of votes. 9 million You got the Farage lot, Reform, getting something like 4 million, 4.25 million. You get the Greens getting something like I think 2 million, around 2 million. And then there's a lot of independents. I mean, the Green down here, when Caroline Lucas, she's replaced Caroline Lucas. But generally speaking, his government is kind of, I think, for the first time ever, really, I think the government itself is very broad and big, but very shallow. Doesn't have any real, depth in it. It could easily fall apart, depending on events, as to how the trade unions are going to react. To any new austerity, so on and so on. So I think we're actually in a different situation than we've been before. I think even though he's got such a big majority, it's based on a very small vote, 9 million. I suppose what we have to be wary of is there's going to be what kind of alignment is the Tories going to go for? Are they going to go for right-wing alignment with the Reform and figure out some kind of coalition or whatever? So I think that's going to be an interesting situation as to where the Tory party goes to that. But I don't really have much more to say. I think that France is interesting. I mean, their left has been very weak, but events happen. Suddenly, it all comes together, even though there have to be, big compromises made. But those kind of things, you don't know, do we? I mean, it could happen here, as they say. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction out there. A lot of it was a big move. He's got the landslide, and it's like a loveless landslide. I think it's a loveless landslide. Nobody is that enthusiastic about it all or whatever. And I think people are generally speaking, overall, are kind of hoping something happens, but deep down, kind of know that it's not going to happen. And as I say, events, as McMahon said, and any other good, events, my boy. That's it. Yeah. Yeah, I finished. Yeah.
You're on mute, Nick. You're muted. Toby, while Nick works out his mute, you put your hand up. Do you want to make a contribution?
Yeah, okay. Look, I wasn't in Britain during the election campaign. It was originally my intention to be, so I won't get into why it's a health thing. But if I'd known, I would have got a proxy vote. But as it was, I didn't vote. It wasn't a conscious abstention. Now, what I wanted to say was in the Italian press, and I don't know if it got into the British press, the third telephone call that Starmer made after going into number 10 on Friday afternoon was to someone I think you might expect. Look, the first two were obvious. It was Biden, phone call number 1 of the international phone calls we're talking about. Phone call number 1 to Biden, second phone call to the Irish PM. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name offhand. I knew Varadkar's name, but not the new one. But anyway, the third telephone call that that Starmer made, was to Georgia Maloney. Now, I know he says he wants better relations with the EU, but surely the natural thing in those circumstances would have been to have rung up Macron or Scholz. I mean, both because one assumes that he regards them as politically closer to himself, and because traditionally France and Germany were the dominant countries in the EU. So why the hell does he ring up, a neo-fascist prime minister as the first European prime minister he brings up? I mean, look, partly because of his stop the boats, if they're brown, let them drown policy, which is basically the same as hers. She wants to send them to Albania at the moment, but it struck me as weird in the sense that if he genuinely wanted to get, I know he said that he doesn't want to. This, in a way, surprises me, given the size of his majority, that he doesn't want to rejoin the customs union, let alone the single market. Whilst, in actual fact, I would have thought you could. Customs union, if you rejoined, would make life a lot easier for a lot of small businesses and so forth. I mean, leaving the customs union is damaging. I'm very aware of it because of the effect it's had on the post between the two countries, but that's not, to most people irrelevant. But he was supposedly seeking better relations. So Maloney is hated by Scholz. She's hated by Macron. She's even hated by the Spanish socialist prime minister. She's hated by the new Polish one because Tusk, he's a Christian Democrat, conservative, call him what you will, but because he hates the PIS, who were the previous lot, who are Maloney's mates, he hates her too. So, I mean, why the hell does he ring her up? I think it was an absolutely despicable act, and it should be publicized in Britain. A basic thing, basic anti-fascist thing to publicize that. It's disgraceful. And on the Red Wall, I better. I realise I've got not much time. On the Red Wall thing, did he actually? I mean, I can't tell from where I am, but presumably he didn't actually get back any of those Red Wall votes. They migrated from Johnsonian conservatism to Farage's semi-fascism. That's what happened. They went to reform. They didn't come back, despite Starmer's flag waving, despite his hard Brexit stuff. Despite all the nationalism and racism that he was pushing, I don't think he won any of these Red Wall people back. And presumably he lost some of the sort of slightly left of centre Remain people to the Lib Dems.
All right, Toby.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Interesting points about the EU and why Starmer wouldn't be looking to rejoin the European Customs Union. And one reason that you've just really touched on there is precisely the support for reform, which comes from the Brexit Party, and the fact that reform was second in, I believe, 102 seats, the majority of those Labour seats. And that shallowness is that if Starmer doesn't deliver something serious or makes a wrong step, some of those MPs next time are going to be not just looking over their shoulder, but losing to reform. And that's if we don't make the significant step of forming the party that has been spoken about by a whole number of comrades on this discussion. Who can I see next who wants to come in to the discussion before I... Well, what I'm going to do, actually, looking at the time, is I'm going to ask Will to come back. There's been a lot of points made, and I don't see any hands. So what I'm going to do, Will, are you... Just one second. There's something in the chat that I haven't seen. Okay, it's just Will telling me that there are people with their hands up, which I've called in now. So thanks, Will. Will, are you ready to come back?
Yeah, I mean, I can just respond to the discussion as it's gone along, actually.
Thanks.
So, and I probably won't take 10, I'll probably take less because there's other things we have to advertise on next meetings, aren't there? So I think that Chris's point about democratic questions and not ceding them to Farage is a really important question. And not only because of the stuff around representation and democracy, but also I think that Starmer definitely has an authoritarian streak to him. He's definitely somebody who is quite statist and will quite easily push people around on democratic matters if he can get away with it, especially if there is resistance to a whole series of issues that they're trying to push through. So I think the democratic questions will be key, and we need to think about that, and we perhaps should have a discussion about what that means. In regard to Scotland and the state there, what struck me actually in the period 2015 and 16 and just after it, and what's followed, is that 2015 was a chance, whatever your view of it, for Scotland to have independence, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing. And 2016 was a chance to maintain Britain inside the European Union, and whatever your view of that. Scotland stayed in Britain, in the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom stayed out, left the European Union. And so Scotland has found itself in a very weakened state that is deeply troubled, actually. And, you know, just by historical happenstance. And I think that's very important for what's going on in Scotland and what's possible there. Jana, on Palestine and international law, I'll be frank, I have no idea, but it'll be an interesting watch. It'll be interesting to see whether they stick to it, whether Washington can get them to bend, because as you know, they're regular committers of war crimes and suppliers of arms to people who commit war crimes. So it's kind of, you know, going to be an interesting one to watch. And you might be right; they might draw a line there. On Corbyn and Galloway, I'm sorry Sandy isn't here, but because I would have said this if he was here. I think Galloway's invitation was entirely dishonest. And the reason it was entirely dishonest is because he knew there was actually no way that Corbyn would accept it. And he just wanted Corbyn out of the way. Because he knows Corbyn. Corbyn is the least likely person to put himself to be the leader of a party, I think. And it only happened by historical accident. And I think the chances of him going there again or him forming another party are zero. I agree with Soraya. They're absolutely zero. And that's not going to happen. And I have to say, I've got some relief that Galloway didn't win his seat, because I think the guy is a political menace. And I think you only have to look at his program to see what a menace that person is. Unfortunately, but that's just where we are. And Minnie was talking about two things. One, we haven't got very much time. When I was saying that we're on a long march to a new socialist party, right? I can understand why you would think that, but I wasn't talking in terms of time. I was talking in terms of complexity, in terms of people learning the lessons of the past, in terms of people learning the lessons of what happened to the Socialist Party, what happened with respect, why Tusk has had such a terrible and difficult time actually in the last election, and everybody, and me included, all of us having the courage to reflect on why we've made such a bollocks of the last 25 years in terms of building a socialist left. And that's going to be complex, and we're going to have to be honest, and we're going to have open conversations about it. That's the long march. It's entirely possible, I think, as Andy was saying, that, you know, we're in a fragile situation. It's very, very difficult to see what's going to happen next, but it is not impossible that something might emerge in the course of time, especially if reform grows or starts getting even more nasty in terms of the right of British politics. We might have the same shock that the French had. That actually the socialists, and I know that's not the case in France, but the socialists, those who want to see a different kind of society, have got to get their act together. It might be the push that's required, unfortunately, although one wouldn't want to see that. I missed the 1917. I certainly missed that. I missed the 2017 election because I was on holiday. And I missed most of this election because I was again on holiday, but this time I was traveling around the country in a van that I own. motorhome that I own. And I tell you what, the only posters I saw were posters at Labour Party headquarters in some houses. I saw very few Liberal Democrat posters. I saw, perhaps the only posters I saw for the Tories were Tory headquarters. You'd gone around the country and it was almost like a general election wasn't happening. The level of disinterest was huge, really. And I think that you know, that situation, I don't think Starmer will be able to hold the centre. So I don't think we're going to be in for quiet times. I think we're going to be in very active and somewhat chaotic time. I agree the left is in a mess. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And just as an aside, I've been reading E.P. Thompson's The Makings of the English Working Class. And there's a chapter in that book which is really worth reading, because it's about how people tried to lead movements and misled them in the 1810s and the 1820s. And the chapter's headed Demagogues and Martyrs. And there were lots of people who thought they were leading who were into demagoguery and into their own self-interest. And there were many working class people who paid the price for that. And in a way, you know, Corbyn's not a demagogue, you know what I mean? But certainly I think we can think of others on the left who are. And I think we have to be really careful not to allow the socialist message to disappear under that kind of politics ever again. We face three crises. We're going to face an economic crisis. Again, I refer to the Michael Roberts article, Broken Brick, and it's absolutely brilliant. We face a climate crisis, and we face a crisis which is a march to war. And we really have to put our thinking hats on and our activity hats on and work out how we can bring together what we know is a fairly large layer of people that can generate the momentum towards a new mass socialist party.
Thank you very much, Will, for introducing what was a very good discussion, and for your reply there, taking up almost all the points. Clearly, we're going to have to keep coming back to the strategic and tactical issues that have been raised in this discussion. Forthcoming meetings that we've got are, as you know, we have the meetings fortnightly. So in 2 weeks' time, on the 22nd of July, we've got an assessment on the European election results. Now, we're going to have to give some consideration to that, because obviously that's been overtaken in a sense by the events in France. And a number of people in this discussion have raised the question of what's called a popular front. It raises issues about the Popular Front in France in 1936. It raises questions about what attitude communists should take to the question of the independence of their own program, and whether in going into coalitions or alliances with people to the right, they're expected to drop their program, give up seats, give up contestations. So what's the correct position that should be taken? So that's possibly something that we'll just have to tweak a bit, precisely because what we saw in these elections and the rise of reform is an element of what's happened across continental Europe with the rise of the popular right. So we'll have to touch on both of those issues. On the 5th of August, we've got writer and housing activist Isaac Rose, who's going to be speaking on his new book, The Rentier City, Manchester and the Making of the Neoliberal Metropolis. Details of that are in the bulletin that we sent out. Then on the 19th of August, we got Ao Lung Yu. He's going to introduce a discussion on Is China Socialist? There's a couple of new articles that have gone up on the website. We've got the video now up on YouTube of the last discussion, which was Ed Potts and Chris Strafford talking about communist future. So we need to come back to this. Clearly, as Minnie and others said, at least as I understand, they were saying, you know, it's a race against time. It is urgent that the left the socialist and communist left gets its act together. We want to see, that's talking about socialism and the purpose of these discussions, we want to see the bringing into creation a new mass communist stroke socialist party. You choose your term. That's a point for discussion. There are clearly big organizations out there on whom there is a big responsibility. They could take the initiative in bringing together the socialist left. I'm talking about the RCP, formerly Socialist Appeal, the Socialist Party, the SWP. There are smaller groups, Communist Party of Great Britain, and others. We need to find some way of persuading the bigger organizations to take a lead in bringing people together. If that doesn't happen, we need to discuss what we can do. Will's ideas of socialist clubs, Chris's point about communist cells around the country. We need to find a route to the groups of people who are attracted to the ideas of a fundamental break with capitalism. We believe that there are tens of thousands of them, many of them disorganized, not in anything. We need to find a way to reach them. So if you're in touch with them, if you know of groups in your area, if you know of people through your contacts and political allegiances, then please let us know, let them know about us and get them to come along. We want more discussion, more debate, more differences, talk things through, clarify ideas, but we do want to take concrete steps, and perhaps we're going to have to turn some of these discussions more to practical steps that we can take in order to achieve our goal. So with that, I'll thank everybody for attending tonight's meeting. I hope you have enjoyed it. We'll see you again in a fortnight's time. Thank you very much. Good night.